Hello, welcome to Skills-Based Health on Demand, brought to you by DESE, Missouri Healthy Schools, and MOSHAPE. We are excited to be covering Standard 2 today, Analyze Influences. This is part of our National Health Education Standards series where we are taking a deep dive into each standard. I am here with the fabulous Kim Goforth. My name is Brad Brummel. I'm the Health and PE Coordinator for Springfield Public Schools.
And
Kim, how are you today?
I am great. How are you today, Brad?
Doing excellent.
Good. And I am here with the fabulous Brad Brummel. I am Kim Goforth, and I am part of the Columbia Public Schools, and I am their K-12 Health and PE Coordinator. So welcome, everyone. Today's dive into Standard 2 has some pretty deep learning objectives that we're going to work through with you today. And so we wanted to get these out in front of you. So we're going to talk about the components of Standard 2. And what that means is really a deep dive into the performance indicators. And we're going to look at what mastery means for those performance indicators. We're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about planning for instruction and then some practice opportunities for your students to get into Standard 2's performance indicators. So really from an instructional lens on how we can get mastery from our students. And then we're going to have you guys take some time to explore the resources that Brad and I will put in front of you today to further that learning in instruction and practice. And then making a strong connection between the skill of Standard 2 and to the content that you will have in your classes. We're going to give you a chance to connect those two things. So that is what we're hoping that you take away from our session today on Standard 2.
Thanks, Kim. So we have a training guide available for you. If you would access the link in the YouTube description, you'll be able to print and use that training guide that way, or you can download it. It's a fillable PDF. Then you can save it digitally and use that to your advantage. So please access the training guide because you'll be using that throughout today's video.
Great, very helpful. Well, we're going to start with a high-level overview of the National Health Education Standards. And so there are 8 standards. And so just as a quick review, Standard 1 talks about identifying the functional health knowledge that your students will need. So thinking from a very content-based standard is Standard 1. Then Standards 2 through 8 dig very deep into each individual health skill. And so making this transition to a skills-based health education is where the grit of 2 through 8 come from. Now, each standard 2 through 8 is further broken down into performance indicators. And then those performance indicators are further broken down into grade spans. And so there is a pre-K2 grade span, 3-5 grade span, 6-8, and then 9-12. So again, today's focus will be on Standard 2, Analyze Influences, and we will get rolling with that.
So Standard 2 is all about analyzing the influence of our family, peers, culture, media, technology, and other factors on our health behaviors. We really are striving for students to understand what internal factors there are and what external factors there are and how they impact our health choices and our health behaviors. And so, Kim, as we reflect on this standard and we connect it to the goals of health education, how do you see the connection there?
I think this one's a big one. I feel like this one's kind of paramount for a lot of things. You know, you analyze different, things, influences that come at you on a daily basis, and then how is that going to make me have more reflective decision-making practices, maybe, or to be very intentional about the decisions that I make. And so, I'm using these words that also talk about other standards. And so I think that analyzing the influences that we have in our life can really partner well with some of our other skills. And so I feel like it's a foundational skill to be aware of what influences are coming at us on a daily basis that's going to affect our health behaviors later in life. So I feel like that kind of meets these goals of health education on behaviors and becoming a little bit more health literate. So I feel like it's paramount. Would you echo that feeling? Did I miss something?
No, I mean, if we're allowing students to have the skill to analyze healthy choices and unhealthy choices, we're ultimately empowering our students. Right. And ultimately, it's hard for them to address unhealthy behaviors if they're not knowing where they're coming from. So I think that it's an easy connection to our overall goals of health education. And I think you described it very well.
Yeah. Well, we both have same but different feelings on that. And so as a viewer, we'd like you to take an opportunity here to engage in your training guide and talk about how you see this particular standard 2 of analyzing influences. How does that connect to those overall health education goals? What spoke to you in some of those goals, and then the language in this standard. So take a minute, pause the video if you need to, and answer that question on page 1 of your training guide.
So here we see the vertical grade level progression for standard 2. I love how it's broken down into grade spans, because as always, we talk about time, and if we feel like in kindergarten and for a teacher 1 year they didn't get all of those performance indicators achieved, we have 3 grade levels to get this achieved. And so it's not going to happen for all students at 1 grade level. But I love how you can see the grade level progression in a vertical manner here, and it's really nice to see that at that elementary primary level, we're just starting off by looking at the likes and dislikes of students, because a kindergartner is not going to be able to evaluate an external influence right away. And so we're just starting about what do I like, what do I dislike. We're connecting those likes and dislikes to our culture and our community and future choices. And then as those students progress into elementary school, we're going to be talking a lot more about personality. And then as they move to middle school, now we're starting to really help our students be able to differentiate between those internal influences and external influences, and hopefully to be able to connect those to their future health choices and behaviors. And then as we progress to high school, you see the shift in verb there to evaluate. So we're getting to a high order of thinking. And I love how we even move into our community, the policies at school, more of that advocacy piece. And so you can see, I hope this helps you understand the standard as a whole by looking at it in a vertical manner here. So now as we break down into the specific performance indicators, here's an example of the middle school, grades 6 through 8 indicators. I would just highlight here that you again can see a lot of mentions of behaviors, a lot of mentioning of family and peers and influences. And ultimately, we're trying to allow students to use, we all have influences, but ultimately we're trying to get students to understand where these influences are coming from and how they impact their behaviors. So again, what is influencing me as a student, and why is this influencing and impacting my behavior? Kim, as we look at the high school performance indicators, what sticks out to you?
Well, you kept mentioning the verbs. So when I compare middle level to this high school, I see a lot more higher level cognitive verbs. We do move everything to analyze here at the 9-12 grade span, and we add in some evaluates. And another piece that I looked at, and I can see terms like in the 6-8 grade span, it said, how does this impact? And then when we look at this 9-12, we see more of what's the impact of. So really focusing on the impact. And I really see it as a kind of a cause and effect. And so, you take those high school students and say, all of these influences are coming at you, moving into perhaps graduating and being on your own. What is the cause of these influences, and then what is my effect? What's going to happen if I choose this direction for my health behavior? So I see these a lot more as a cause and effect in a real deep analysis compared to 6-8. So those were some of my big takeaways from the comparison. So and now it's your turn as the viewer to kind of dig in by your grade span. Look at the performance indicators for Standard 2 for your particular grade span. pick a performance indicator that maybe you're wrestling with in your district, within your own classroom, and identify one that you feel, I need to take a close look at that and really dive in. And then kind of why did you select that? And so as the viewers are looking through that, Brad, is there something in the 6-8 grade span that down in Springfield you think you'd like to kind of continue to wrestle with or focus on?
Yeah, I think that I'm going to talk a little bit more today just about performance indicators 1, 2, and 3 in that 6 through 8 grade span, where they're identifying internal and external influences, and ultimately they're able to first define it and then be able to identify which ones are internal and which ones are external.
Great. Very important stuff.
Yeah. What about you, Kim?
I'm going to focus on high school a little bit. So when I looked at those, two kind of spoke to me, and I think it's this COVID world we've been living in. But as you mentioned, as you get to the upper grades, we look a little bit more at the community and the school community. And so I was thinking on, I'm going to look back here. It was performance indicator 4 and 10. So 4 talked about that school community, and then 10 talks about community health and how laws and regulations have kind of dictated some health behaviors. And I think about mask wearing and things like that. So those are things that I'd like to focus on. And we can talk about it a little bit more here with our instructional planning, but those were going to be mindful to me.
Yeah. So before we move on, again, performance indicators for Standard 2 are linked in your training guide. If it helps you to review all of them, great. If not, just focus on your grade span and just kind of make yourself more familiar. And then, like Kim mentioned, select one that you'd like to dive a little deeper on.
Great.
So next, we're going to jump right into the backwards design to kind of help us progress forward. So we've started with our goals of health education. We know how Standard 2 helps us reach those. We just broke down the standard. You saw it in a vertical, holistic view. Then now we've just dove into and looked at the specific performance indicators. And so next we're going to figure out, okay, how will we know when our students master this skill? And so we want our assessments and our mastery to be aligned to our performance indicators. But this is next. Before we start worrying about how we're going to teach this skill, we want to figure out how will we know when students have mastered this skill? And so we're going to next speak on the assessment and the mastery piece. And as Standard 2, as we look at Standard 2 from a holistic view, these are kind of what mastery looks like for Standard 2 as a whole. So again, we've talked about these internal and external influences. I know Kim's talked a lot about being able to analyze the influences and ultimately knowing how it influences their healthy lifestyle. But this is kind of what that looks like for a student for Standard 2 as a whole. Next, I wanted to give you an example of what mastery looks like at the 6 through 8 level. I think one of the important things to consider when we talk about mastery is that it allows us to use a student-friendly language when communicating to our students, when giving feedback, so that our students have a great understanding of what they're trying to accomplish, what they're trying to do. Because if we only use the performance indicator or standard or outcome language, a lot of times it can go way over our students' head and it doesn't help us achieve our outcome. So breaking it down from taking one of these performance indicators, you can see how they're broken down into I can statements. This is kind of how we're identifying what mastery will look like, what our students will be able to do after we've chosen that performance indicator.
Brad, I like on that first one, putting it into a student-friendly language where it says, the performance indicator says I can examine how the family, students can say, how am I supposed to examine? But they can hear explore and maybe free them up a little bit. So I really like the student-friendly language in your performance indicators. So,
and it should help us with our planning too, right? Sometimes we have a hard time going straight from the performance indicator to planning our instruction. And that's why this is the important step in that backwards design, is taking a moment to look at what mastery will look like. Okay, what will my students actually be doing? What will that look like? And then we can start planning our practice opportunities, and instruction based off of that mastery statement. So
Right.
it's an important step to take. Sometimes it takes some time, but it's an important step.
It is very important. So as the viewer, you take this important step with us here and take that performance indicator that you felt very strongly about for your district, your classroom, and think about that to do. Think about that mastery item. What will it look like for your students to master that performance indicator? Use some student-friendly language. Like Brad and I just talked about, it might be hard to dig in a little bit and to tear that performance indicator apart on kind of a sequential flow, but what will your students need to do to show you mastery? So take a minute and use your training guide to answer that question on page 2. All right, a little bit more about mastery. When I looked at the 912 list, Brad, I was a little overwhelmed. They were pretty deep, cognitive level wise. They were pretty long. They were pretty wordy. And in my curriculum brain, I kept thinking, boy, how would I write a summative assessment that includes all of those? And so we're going to take you through some resources later, but there are some tips and tricks. And so assessment tools can cover a lot of the indicators. It's not just one time assess it, one time assess it. There are some assessment tools that we will share. Like I said, you need to think of clustering a lot of these performance indicators, like Brad has talked about 1 through 3 for 6-8 grade span, and I've talked about 4 and 10. So how do we partner these together to then look for mastery? And so if you want to reflect in your training guide a little bit too on page 2, if you need to partner some and marry some, more the merrier in the mastery sense. So we will get to that, but that's very important that it's not just a one-stop shop. You can cluster these. It'd be very helpful.
Yeah, and then I would add that you can notice here with the RMC Health examples that their assessment tool is not a multiple choice quiz, right? It doesn't have to be an end of unit test to assess those performance indicators. You can see that their assessment tools are learning activities. They're a lot of times hands-on activities. And so these assessment tools are engaging and also practice opportunities, but at the same time, an opportunity for students to show you that they've mastered that skill. And these assessment tool ideas are a lot easier to find or create once you've made that student-friendly language I can or mastery statement. It's a lot harder to create these if you're just simply trying to use the performance indicator. So again, mastery is an important step of the planning process. So we will go back to the backwards design. We focused on goals and standards, performance indicators. We've written our I can statement for our mastery. And so the next step is for us to focus on how will our students practice this skill and apply it to the real world? And then what will my steps of instruction look like? Because we know that if we're trying to help students learn a skill, we need to break it down for them. We need to model it for them. And a lot of times these two steps will come hand in hand. It's really hard to separate these two in our planning process. Sometimes we may even plan what that instruction is going to look like before we do the practice opportunities. And so I like to look at these two coming kind of molding together. And so we're going to jump into that by showing you these teaching progressions created by RMC Health. And one of my favorite parts of the RMC Health resources are they break each skill down into steps and they differentiate it for each grade level span. We've provided the secondary examples in the K through 2 and the 3 through 5 steps would look even different than these two. But you can see that at the 6 through 8 level, step 1 is to identify the influence. Then it's to connect that influence to the behaviors, whether it's healthy or unhealthy. And then step 3 to connect to influences to the future. And the high school is very similar. The only thing is you see the difference between behavior and outcome. And that's just that next level of being able to analyze that Kim has discussed. But you can see the teaching progressions that's going to be involved in that instruction broken down by step. Kim, anything else you'd add to this teaching progression?
No, I think it's great, and I agree with you. To break down by step helps our sequential brain. But yeah, the pre-K through 5 looks a little bit different. They have a few more steps, and so if that is your grade span, know that you'll have a couple extra steps, but nothing too monumental. But this is perfect.
And so for me in my middle school example that I was explaining earlier with performance indicators 1 through 3, I'm going to focus on step 1, identify influences. And so the subskills that I'm going to be teaching is, number 1, I want them to be able to define what an influence is. And so in my example, I'm going to define it as a whole group, whole class, short instruction. And then I'm going to show them a video where they see different examples of influences, and they're going to be using a note catcher to write down the influences and then be able to try to differentiate between whether that was a internal influence or an external influence. And so just a short video opportunity where they're first learning the skill with a video example, and then we're going to kind of move into some activities where they're going to do that self-reflect. Another thing that you'll see on these teaching tips is that we want to be really careful to not push our own opinion on whether our understanding of an influence, because that may depend on a student's identity, background, culture. And so you want to be really careful to push your own opinion in these situations of identifying an influence, especially whether it's internal, external, or whether it's healthy or unhealthy. Allow the students to come to their own conclusion. So the 2 practice opportunities, I'm just going to briefly explain. One idea would be to hand out brown bags to students, and they are going to identify how they think society views their identity, or how themselves view their identity. And so on the outside of the bag, they can draw pictures, words of things that someone is going to think of them right away, something that society thinks of them, or their friends, peers, teachers. And so I listed a couple things, people that maybe don't know me well, but people that just see me at work or at school, they know that I'm an administrator. They think that, oh, he must be healthy because he's the PE coordinator, which I hope is true, but sometimes not as much as true as I want it to be. I'm a white male, and so people are going to label me as privileged. And then on the inside of the bag, students are going to be putting things or drawing things, writing things that society will not know, or a peer will not know, until they get to know them better. And so that we're kind of differentiating between how society views us, what we really are. And so we're really exploring that identity. And then students are going to explore which one of those things are influenced by society, by family, by peers. And then the second activity is more of a mind map, where they're doing a similar process, but they're mapping it out. And then at the end of that map, after they've written down a bunch of influences, they're color coding it with 2 different colors, which ones are internal and external. So just 2 opportunities for them to really self-explore, reflect, and then to try to differentiate between those internal and external.
Great. Brad, I don't know if I'd consider you tough. Like, I don't know if, I hope no one's told you that.
So
you have teachers down there that think, oh, he's the toughest administrator. I would never say that.
So I'm glad you said that, because one of the teaching tips on that activity is that some of the things on the bag are going to be right in your opinion, and some things are going to be wrong in your opinion. And so that's when a student gets an opportunity to kind of explain their bag to other students, you're going to have that conversation come up. Well, I wouldn't have thought that. And so you start to kind of be able to get to communicate and explain some of the things that you wrote down. So anyways.
Well, I'll be a positive influence on you, Brad. You're not tough. You're
I appreciate that.
You bet. You bet. Well, I'll kind of piggyback and just share briefly kind of my thoughts on a 9-12 example that I talked about, performance indicator 4 and 10, trying to make those connections. And Brad talked about step 1, where you're identifying those influences. And in the 9-12 grade span, this first instructional planning piece, I'm going to jump to step 2. And so step 1, we would have already made some identifications of influences that they have in their life. And the job in step 2 in my planning is to connect those influences to outcomes. And so when I look at this instructional planning, I have to find a way to take our step 1 content and connect it to some outcomes. And so I might do that from whatever, Brad mentioned mapping. I think that'd be a good one for 912 as well. But instead of just identifying if it's internal or external, the next layer for my instruction would be, how can I make this connected to an outcome? And so they would take those influences, and be it another mapping where they do color code, what would the possible outcomes be? They can brainstorm just with themselves. They can partner up and say, hey, I noticed we had the same influence of my family or my culture. What would the outcome be if I went against that? Or what if I went with it? And so trying to connect and predict maybe some outcomes would be my step 2 instructional planning. And then if I say, well, how do they need to wrestle with that? What activities can I give them for practice in connecting these influences? And this, as I look at the practice opportunities and teaching tips, the teaching tip that is huge, I think, for 912 is this analyze. Kids have a hard time with what the verb analyze means. And so we as teachers have to provide those things to analyze. Like Brad said, an analyze verb indicator won't give you a multiple choice answer. They're not analyzing truly unless it's a long scenario based multiple choice. So we have to give students chances to truly analyze as a whole class, as individual reflection, drawing, movement based journaling, role play. So giving kids an opportunity to practice analyzing is a teaching tip that moves us into their practice. So how can they practice? So if you use my examples of school and community health and policy and how that drives and influences health behavior, I think about what can I give them to analyze? And so as a practice opportunity, I would have to present my small groups or my whole class a health policy. And so, thinking to the COVID world, I would share when the city of Columbia would change their mask ordinance, and we've changed it several times in the last, 10 months. And so I would place that policy in front of groups, have them dig in, read it, have a reflective piece, be it a journal, be it a group map, and do a gallery walk. How does that connect to this community? What has happened? How did that affect them? And answer these 3 questions. Who did this policy affect? How did it affect us? And how will it impact our future health behaviors? And so really analyzing a policy is going to show them the outcome or the result. And so this would be a practice opportunity that you could put in front of them several times to meet this 9-12 grade span indicator. So just being thoughtful of how can they truly analyze and make that connection for the outcome. So that's one 9-12 example that you can kind of chunk through if that's your grade span. So Brad's example of middle school, mine of high school. Now it's your turn to kind of think through that instructional planning process, and then where are you going to give students that chance to practice truly at that verb level. So your turn in your training guide. Look at your instructional planning steps. What would that look like? Look at the performance indicator and how you can get practice opportunities. And then the key question is, how will you know when they've mastered that particular indicator? And you may have 2, like Brad and I had multiple. So think through that process for the indicator or indicators that you chose earlier in the training and get to work in your training guide on page 3.
Absolutely. And if you want some help, me and Kim both always utilize our RMC skill guides. We are going to link that in the training guide for you, and we want to show you what that looks like just so that you have an idea of kind of how it can help you. So the first thing it can help you with is the steps. It does a great job of explaining the steps, breaking it down into those sub skills, which can make it even easier to kind of figure out how am I going to help students learn this skill. And then those teaching tips are huge. This comes in huge when you're trying to figure out your instruction, how you're going to model the skill, kind of keep you out, like the advice on being careful about pushing your opinion on in this specific content. I think that's huge advice. And so you can check out these teaching tips in the skill guides as well. And then my favorite part, the suggested learning activities. These are examples at the appropriate grade level of ideas that you can pull. And it's not a curriculum. They're just ideas for you to help students learn these skills and subskills. And so you can see that this is a suggested learning activity for the specific subskill of defining influence. And this is one of the examples that I pulled. So it explains, show students a video, gives you examples of language of health literacy. And so it breaks it down, and again, more teaching notes. And at the very bottom of the resource, you'll find a resource bank with links to specific resources. Again, we cannot brag on the RMC Health Skill Guides enough. The digital versions are all free. And if you want the whole printed, you can order those for $45 for your grade span. They're really inexpensive. So again, use this RMC Health Skill Guides to help you. But there's also nothing wrong with going and creating your own either. You may already have an idea that you currently implement that you're just tweaking and twisting to be more skill-based. And so, Kim, anything else to talk about on the skill guides before we move on?
No, I just love them. And I will say on the language of health literacy that it's on every training guide. It's very helpful for if you're exploring journaling. Those can be some fantastic prompts that you give your students. And so really leverage these skill guides. RMC Health has done a fantastic job to help us out as health educators. So yeah, it's good stuff. And so as Brad's talking, I get real geeked out about it and I find all these health skills and yes, I want to implement. And then my brain says, well, what about the content? Where am I going to put that in my content flow, how I've always set my health class up? And so we challenge you to go in and look at the HECAT because as it outlines its modules, I could look at mine and say, well, I think analyze influences is so important and I want to get these activities to everybody. But then if I would say to you, Brad, with your 3 examples, where would you put that in your content? Where would you put this standard in your content?
Yeah, so like if my curriculum guide if my scope and sequence is already set up by content unit by unit, then, and I really wanted to teach standard 2, I think I would probably start off by throwing these suggested learning activities within my personal health and wellness unit, because I think that's an easy connection to include those lessons and skills and instruction within that personal health and wellness unit.
Right. I think that's fair. That's a good one. Yeah. If I was looking at my 912, I'd fit it there. I'd fit personal health and wellness and also comprehensive health education. I think that kind of goes across the communal span. But I can honestly make a case for all of these, I mean, influences on drugs and other alcohol and other drugs, healthy eating choices, influences on my eating is crazy around here at work lately. But, I mean, I can make a case for any of these. And so I think they will partner well. Any skill will partner well, but dig into the HECAT a little bit and look at these modules and see where you could, if you are a very content driven curricular flow. And so as the viewer, take some time now to try to connect that performance indicator that you've been wrestling with during this training session. And ask yourself, where could I fit that into my content? Because I think you'll surprise yourself. It could go so many places, and there's nothing wrong with doing it in a lot of places. What a good skill to learn, and that's why we keep practicing to put it in as many places as you can. So take a minute now on page 3 and answer that question about making a connection to your content.
And Kim, if there's a teacher that has made the complete shift and they're just their scope and sequence is guided by the skills and the national standards, this is a great standard that can be intertwined with any other national standard. Right. It goes great with decision making. It goes great with self-management. You can really mix and align this standard with just about any other national standard. That's the other great thing about standard 2. I
agree. Good point.
So as we move forward, we just wanted to remind you of the upcoming sessions and the other sessions that are offered through the skills-based health on-demand session. You just finish watching Analyze Influences, there will be a video on the remaining standards as well as instructional strategies. And if you did not check out the Why Skills-Based Health or Making the Shift, those 2 videos we would recommend you checking out. Again, thank you to DESE, Missouri Healthy Schools, MOSHAPE, and RMC Health, and my fabulous partner, Kim Goforth. Thank you for watching today, and see you, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.